The last thing you see in Game of Thrones is a boy on a boat, sailing toward the end of the map. The first thing that ever happened in Westeros was a war between two species over who owned a continent. Between those two moments is 12,000 years of the same story repeating itself, in different costumes, with different names, always ending the same way. Not with victory, with wreckage. And someone, in the wreckage, deciding to start again. This is not a story about good and evil. Westeros never had those. It had the living and the dead, the powerful and the crushed, the people who remembered and the people who forgot. And forgetting, in Westeros, was always the thing that killed you. Every collapse in this history follows the same structure. Something is built, something is ignored. The ignored thing returns. The built thing falls. A new thing rises on the rubble, convinced it has finally solved the problem. It hasn't. It never does. The war was always going to fall. The Targaryen dynasty was always going to burn itself out. The Seven Kingdoms were always too many kingdoms to hold as one. And the children of the forest, the first people, the oldest people, were always going to lose. Not because they were weak, but because they made the single decision that no civilization ever recovers from. They created a weapon they could not control, and then forgot they had created it. That weapon had blue eyes. And 12,000 years later, it came back to collect. If you enjoy videos that take the history behind the stories seriously, that connect what actually happened to what George R.R. Martin built, I'd genuinely appreciate it if you hit that like button and subscribe. It helps more than you know. Now, settle in, get yourself nice and comfortable. Let's begin. Before there was a Westeros, before there were kingdoms or kings or the concept of a king, there was a forest. The whole continent was forest. Scholars in Martin's world call this the Dawn Age, and they date it to approximately 12,000 years before the events of Game of Thrones. Though the number is speculative, because the people who lived through it did not write things down. They didn't need to. They remembered differently. They were the children of the forest, small, dark, with slit-pupilled eyes, the colour of gold or green, never taller than a human child, bound to the trees and the earth in ways that human language, then and now, struggles to describe. They called themselves the children, Nal in their own tongue, meaning those who sing the song of earth, and Westeros was theirs for longer than any human civilization has ever existed anywhere on the planet. 12,000 years. Hold that number for a moment. The oldest human civilization we have records of, Sumeria, in what is now Iraq, is roughly 5,000 years old. The children of the forest had already been in Westeros for 7,000 years before the first Sumerian scratched the first cuneiform into the first clay tablet. They were old. They were rooted. And they had, during those millennia, developed a relationship with their continent that was less political and more organic. They did not rule Westeros the way a king rules a kingdom. They were embedded in it, the way mycelium is embedded in soil. You don't see it. It's doing everything. Their power was what Martin calls the green sight, the ability to see through time, to witness events past and future through the neural network of weirwood trees whose roots connected every part of the continent in a vast, slow, vegetable internet. The three-eyed raven that Bran Stark spends 3 seasons pursuing is not a metaphor. It is a specific individual, the last surviving green seer of the children's tradition, sitting in a cave, his body grown into the roots of a weirwood tree, still watching, still remembering. 12,000 years of accumulated memory living in the mycelium beneath the snow. This is what the children were: memory made flesh, history made continuous. And then humans arrived. The first men came from the east, crossing a land bridge that no longer exists. The arm of dawn, now shattered into the islands called the Stepstones, and they came with bronze weapons, horses. And the particular human talent for looking at a landscape and seeing not what it is, but what it could be turned into. They began cutting down the weirwood trees, not because they were evil, not because they hated the children, because they needed farmland, because they were hungry, because they had always done this everywhere they had ever gone, and it had always worked before. This is the first collapse in Westeros' history. Not a battle, not a political crisis. A deforestation. The children fought back. They used the green sight, the hammer of the waters, a geological catastrophe they called down on the arm of dawn that shattered the land bridge and flooded the neck of the continent, creating the swamp called the Neck that would remain a natural barrier for the rest of Westerosi history. They were trying to stop the invasion. They stopped the reinforcements. The men already inside the continent kept coming. The war between the children and the first men lasted approximately 2,000 years. 2,000 years of low-level conflict, skirmishes in the forest, the children retreating north and deeper into the wilds as the humans cut and burned and planted. Then, 4,000 years before the events of Game of Thrones, the war ended. Both sides were tired. The children's numbers were in irreversible decline. The men had carved out enough territory to feel secure. They met on a small island in the middle of a lake, God's Eye, it would later be called, and they made a peace. The pact. The humans would keep the open lines. The children would keep the forests. The weirwood trees would be left standing. The carved faces in the heart trees, the eyes and mouths that the children had cut into them, the nodes of the green sight network, would be respected, not destroyed. It was, on its face, a reasonable settlement. Two civilizations, exhausted by conflict, drawing a line and agreeing to stay on their respective sides. And for 2,000 years, it more or less held. The first men adopted the children's gods, the old gods, the nameless ones of the trees and rivers, and carved their own faces into weirdwood hearts in the manner of the children. And the two cultures began, slowly, to merge. But the pact had a structural flaw that nobody talked about. The humans were still cutting trees, slowly, carefully, in the areas the pact designated as theirs, but still cutting, still reducing the network. And the children, whose entire civilization depended on the weirdwood network, whose memory, whose power, whose very sense of identity was embedded in those trees, were watching their substrate shrink. Not dramatically, not all at once. The way glaciers melt, the way species go extinct, too slowly to feel like an emergency, until suddenly it is one. Here is where the first unforgivable decision gets made. We don't know exactly when, we don't know exactly who. The maesters of the Citadel, who are the closest thing Westeros has to historians, record almost nothing reliable about this period. What we know comes from Bran Stark's visions, from the three-eyed raven's memories, from fragments. But the decision was made. Facing what they recognized as eventual extinction, the children of the forest chose to create a weapon. They took a human man, a first man, a prisoner, or perhaps a volunteer. The accounts differ, and the distinction may be unknowable, and they pressed a shard of dragonglass into his chest, directly into his heart. Dragonglass is what the people of Westeros called obsidian, volcanic glass, formed in the interior heat of the earth. And they pressed it into his heart, and they worked their magic, the same magic they used to shape the earth, to read the trees, to see through time, and they turned him. They removed something from him, not his intelligence, not his capability. They removed his warmth, his humanity, his connection to the living world, and they replaced it with something older and colder and absolute. They created the first White Walker. The plan, insofar as there was one, appears to have been military. A weapon against the humans. An enforcer. Something to make the men of the South afraid enough to stop cutting. What they got instead was a force that recognized no treaty, acknowledged no pact, took orders from no one, and whose single operational objective, converting the living into the dead. Expanding the army of the night was not a strategy, but a nature. They had not created a soldier, they had created a process, an intrepidity made animate. What followed is called the Long Night. Approximately 8,000 years before the events of Game of Thrones, a winter came that lasted a generation. The sources disagree on how long. Some say years, some say decades, but they agree on the darkness and the cold and the dead walking. The White Walkers came south with their army of whites, the reanimated corpses of everyone they had killed, and they killed everything. Children of the forest. first men, everything. The distinction between the two species that had spent 2,000 years fighting each other suddenly became meaningless. Against the dead, the living were one category. This is where Martin is working from real historical material, and the parallel is precise. The Black Death, which swept through Europe between 1347 and 1553, killed between 30 and 60% of the continent's population, somewhere between 25 and 50 million people in 6 years. It did not distinguish between the French and the English, who had been killing each other in the 100 Years' War. It did not distinguish between Catholics and heretics, between nobles and serfs, between the guilty and the innocent. It was an equalizer. And one of its defining psychological effects, documented in the chronicles of the period, in the art that survives, in the literature from Boccaccio to Langland, was that it broke down the social structures that had seemed permanent. The hierarchies, the obligations, the assumptions about who served whom, and what God wanted, and what the future would look like, all of it dissolved in the face of something that did not care about any of it. The long night did the same thing to Westeros. The children of the forest and the first men, the two civilizations that had been in conflict for 2,000 years, fought together. And a man named Azor Ahai, or a woman, the sources are not reliable on the gender, forged a weapon of fire, a sword called Lightbringer, and led the alliance against the dead. And the hero whom the free folk of the north would later call the last hero went to the children of the forest and asked for the knowledge the children had, and the children gave it, because survival does not negotiate. The weapon that defeated the White Walkers was dragon glass, the same material the children had used to create them, the same volcanic glass. It is an elegant, terrible irony that the thing that could destroy the Walker was chemically identical to the thing that had made it. And the wall was built, 300 miles long, 700 feet tall, of ice and magic and the combined engineering of the survivors to keep the dead on the far side. And the Night's Watch was founded to man it, and the White Walkers retreated beyond it, and the long night ended, and everyone forgot what it had cost. Not immediately, not in the first generation or the second. But memory decays. Institutions outlive their understanding. The Night's Watch, which had been founded by warriors with intimate knowledge of what they were guarding against, became within a few centuries a penal colony, a dumping ground for bastards, criminals, and disgraced lords who could be sent somewhere cold and forgotten. The wall went from being the most important structure in the world to being a punchline, a punishment, a place you sent your embarrassments. By the time Jon Snow joins in the first season, the Watch has 10,000 sworn brothers in the official records, and perhaps 1,000 in reality. The castles along the wall, designed for garrisons of several hundred men each, are almost entirely abandoned. The knowledge of what dragonglass does to a White Walker has been lost so completely that Sam Tarly, the most well-read man in the Watch, has to excavate it from texts so old that no one has bothered to copy them for centuries. This is what civilizations do. They create institutions to manage existential threats, and then, when the threat recedes below visibility, they hollow out the institutions. They keep the name, they keep the ritual, they lose the function. Tacitus observed this about the Roman Senate in the 1st century AD, that it had preserved all the forms of the Republic while gutting every substantive power, so that senators went through the motions of debate and vote for measures that Nero had already decided, because the form was reassuring, even when the content was gone. The Night's Watch in Season 1 is the Roman Senate in 65 AD. It knows the words. It has forgotten what the words mean. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. The long night ended. The White Walkers retreated. The wall was built. And Westeros, with its 2 species and its shattered landscape and its traumatic memory, had to figure out how to build something from the rubble. What it built was the Age of Heroes. The Age of Heroes is the period between the end of the Long Night and the arrival of the Andals, roughly 6,000 years before Game of Thrones, and it is the source of almost every foundational myth in Westeros. Gram the Builder, who supposedly raised Winterfell and helped construct the wall. Lan the Clever, the trickster who supposedly swindled Casterly Rock from its original owners and founded the Lannister line. The Grey King of the Iron Islands, who supposedly slew the sea dragon Naga and made his haul from its bones. Duron Godsgrief, who built the first Storm's End and married the daughter of the wind and the sea. These figures are not historical in any recoverable sense. They are myths. But they are myths with a specific function. They explain how the current order of things came to be, and they do so in a way that makes that order seem divinely sanctioned, naturally arising, and permanent. Every ruling house in Westeros traces its legitimacy to the Age of Heroes, the Starks to Bran the Builder, the Lannisters to Lyme the Clever, the Greyjoys to the Grey King. This is not coincidental. When power is uncertain, when you have just survived a catastrophe that killed half your population and destroyed everything you thought you knew, you reach for myth because myth provides what reality cannot, a clean explanation, a divine mandate. A sense that the current arrangement was always meant to be. The Age of Heroes is Westeros processing its trauma by turning its survivors into gods. But here is what was actually happening during those 6,000 years. Beneath the myth-making, the first men were consolidating. Hundreds of petty kings and chieftains, each controlling a valley or a river or a stretch of coast, were fighting each other constantly, a kind of endemic low-level warfare that characterized early medieval Europe, where the unit of political organization was small enough that a single battle could change a lord's fortunes completely. Some of these kingdoms grew, some were absorbed, some were destroyed. The North, the largest region by geography, coalesced around the Starks and their seat at Winterfell. And the Kings of Winter, as the early Stark rulers called themselves, expanded their territory through both conquest and alliance until the entire region north of the Neck acknowledged their authority. The other regions followed similar patterns on smaller scales. The Reach, the most fertile land in Westeros, the agricultural heart of the continent, came under the dominion of the Gardener Kings, who built their seat at Highgarden. The Westerlands, rich in gold and silver, were Lannister country. The Stormlands, wild and wind-lashed, were contested territory that would change hands multiple times over the millennia. And the Iron Islands, the archipelago off the western coast, developed a culture that was unlike anything else in Westeros. A raiding culture, predatory and proud, whose relationship to the mainland was fundamentally parasitic. The Ironborn deserve a moment because they illuminate something about Westeros that the show tends to flatten. The Iron Islands are the worst farmland in Westeros. Rocky, storm-battered, with thin soil that barely supports subsistence agriculture. The people who lived there had two choices: accept poverty or take what they needed from people who had more. They chose the second option and built an entire identity around it. The iron price, the idea that the only honourable way to acquire something is to take it by force, is not a quirk of Ironborn culture. It is a rational adaptation to geography. You can trace almost every violent raiding culture in human history. The Norse, certain Bedouin tribes, the early Mongol clans before their empire phase, to a similar equation. Land too poor to sustain a comfortable life drives people toward predation, and predation becomes culture, and culture becomes identity, and identity becomes the thing you fight to preserve, even when the original material need has changed. The Ironborn had one additional theological justification: the drowned god, their deity, who taught them that what is dead may never die, but rises again, harder and stronger. It is a theology of endurance through violence, a religious framework that sanctifies exactly the behaviour the environment had already selected for. George R.R. Martin is too careful a world builder for this to be accidental. The drowned god theology is what the Ironborn tell themselves to make their way of life feel sacred rather than merely pragmatic. And then the Andals came. Approximately 6,000 years before Game of Thrones, a new human group arrived in Westeros by ship, the Andals, from the eastern continent of Essos, bearing iron weapons instead of bronze, a new religion called the Faith of the Seven, and a particular enthusiasm for cutting down weirwood trees. They came in waves, landing first in the Fingers, the rocky peninsula on the east coast, and they spread south and west with their iron swords, which cut through bronze the way a knife cuts through cloth. The kingdoms of the first man fell. The children of the forest, already reduced in number and retreating steadily northward, were driven almost to extinction. The weirwood trees of the south were felled. The carved faces, the nodes of the green site network, were destroyed. And in their place, the Andals built their seven-pointed stars, and their septs, and their theology of the father and the mother, and the warrior, and the other four faces of the one god they called the Seven. The Andals conquered everywhere south of the Neck within a few centuries. Everywhere, that is, except the north. The north held. The Starks, with their vast territory and their cold winters, and their geography, the Neck, that marshy, narrow passage that any army moving north had to survive, held the Andals at bay and made their peace on their own terms. The first men of the north never converted. They kept the old gods. They kept the weirwood trees. They kept the connection to the children of the forest that the rest of Westeros abandoned. And in the show's final season, when Bran Stark, A Stark, always a Stark, the family that never gave up the old knowledge, becomes the repository of all memory, all history, the entire green site archive of 12,000 years. This is not random. The Starks held on to the thing that mattered when everyone else let it go. But south of the Neck, Andal culture absorbed First Men culture, the way empires absorb provinces, selectively, unevenly, incompletely. The Andals took the kingdoms. They intermarried with the surviving First Men nobility. The faith of the Seven became the dominant religion, but traces of the old gods survived everywhere as superstition, as local custom, as the kind of pre-Christian folk practice that persisted in Europe for centuries after official conversion. The Reach and the Westerlands became thoroughly Andal in character. The Stormlands and the Vale retained more First Men influence. And so Westeros arrived at its pre-Targaryen configuration. 7 independent kingdoms, each with its own dynasty, its own traditions, its own history of grievances and alliances, always on the verge of war with at least one neighbour, held together by nothing except the mutual exhaustion of perpetual conflict. Dragons are Westeros's Mongol cavalry. A single dragon can kill an army. 3 dragons, the number Aegon brought to Westeros, are not a military advantage, they are an argument-ending technological disparity. The moment Aegon Targaryen landed on the eastern coast of Westeros with Balerion, Meraxes, and Viarga, every tactical calculation every king in Westeros had ever made became obsolete. Stone walls don't stop dragonfire. Cavalry don't fight dragons. Numbers don't matter when the other side can incinerate a regiment in a single pass. The Field of Fire, the battle in which Aegon and his sisters burned the combined armies of the Reach and the Westerlands, killing approximately 4,000 men in an afternoon, is not really a battle. It is a demonstration, a proof of concept. It is Genghis Khan's cavalry appearing on the horizon for the first time, and the enemy general realizing that everything he knows about warfare is now wrong. But before the conquest, the destruction, the doom of Valyria, approximately a century before Aegon's conquest, the exact date varies in different accounts, but approximately 400 years before the events of Game of Thrones, the Valyrian freehold ceased to exist. The 14 flames erupted simultaneously. Whether this was a natural geological event, a magical catastrophe, an accident of Valyrian sorcery gone wrong, or something else entirely, is unknown. The records were destroyed along with everything else. What is known is that in the space of a day, some accounts say a day, some say a week, the dominant civilization of the known world was gone. The peninsula sank, the sea rushed in, the dragon roads cracked and fell. The great cities burned and then disappeared under water and ash. 40 dragon-riding families, the dragon lords who had ruled the freehold, died. Their libraries, their records, their accumulated knowledge of dragon bonding and blood magic, and whatever else they had learned in 5,000 years, gone. The Smoking Sea, as the area is now called, is the grave of a civilization. Only one Valyrian family survived intact, the Targaryens. They had received a prophecy. The nature of it is debated, but it involved a dream. Specifically, one member of the family with a gift of prophetic dreams, 12 years before the Doom, and had relocated to a small island off the coast of Westeros called Dragonstone. They took their dragons with them. They were the only dragon lords to survive, and they spent the next 100 years sitting on their island, watching the successor states of Valyria fight each other in what would be called the Century of Blood, apparently waiting for something. What they were waiting for, Aegon Targaryen would later say, was the long night. He had a recurring dream. a winter coming, dead things walking, a darkness from the north. The Song of Ice and Fire, that phrase, which gives Martin's entire series its name, appears in Aegon's private writings as his justification for the conquest. He did not want 7 kingdoms for the wealth. He wanted one kingdom because one kingdom, unified under one command, could respond to the threat from the north. Whether this is true, whether it was rationalization after the fact, whether Aegon really believed it, we cannot know. But it is what he said, and it is what Daenerys would repeat 5 generations later, when she finally crossed the narrow sea herself. Aegon Targaryen was, by the standards of medieval conquest, not a complicated man. His invasion of Westeros in the year 2 BC, before conquest, the dating system his descendants would adopt, is a masterclass in the application of overwhelming force, selective mercy, and political intelligence. He did not try to conquer everywhere at once. He started in the east, at the mouth of the Blackwater Rush, where he built a wooden fort on a hill. The hill that would later be called Aegon's High Hill, and used that as his base. He burned the fleets of the opposing kingdoms when they gathered against him. He offered submission and survival to lords who bent the knee. He demonstrated what happened to those who didn't at Harrenhal. Harrenhal. This needs its own moment. Harren the Black, king of the Isles and the rivers, had spent 40 years building the greatest castle in Westeros on the north shore of the God's Eye. It was enormous. 5 towers, the tallest of which was higher than anything else in Westeros. Walls 12 feet thick at the base, enough space to garrison 10,000 men. It was, by the standards of medieval military architecture, impregnable. Against an army with conventional weapons, it would have been almost impossible to take. Against a dragon, it was a cremation oven. Balerion the Black Dread, the largest dragon that ever lived, old enough that his flame was black tinged with red, with a wingspan wide enough to shadow a town, melted Harrenhal from the outside. The stone towers, superheated by dragon fire, ran like tallow. Harren and all his sons died inside the walls they had spent 40 years building. The castle still stands, warped, melted, haunted, because nobody knows how to tear it down, and nobody wants to live in it. Harrenhal is what Aegon's conquest looks like from the inside. The conquest took 2 years. Missed of it, the North submitted without battle. Torrhen Stark, recognising what he was dealing with, knelt before Aegon at the Trident and handed over his crown. He is called the King Who Knelt in the histories, and it is not a flattering epithet. But Torrhen Stark made the calculation that submitting and keeping his family alive was preferable to the alternative. And every subsequent generation of Starks got to live because of that calculation. The Reach submitted after the Field of Fire, the Westerlands after, the Stormlands after the burning of the fleet. Dorne held out. Dorne always held out, using guerrilla warfare and assassination to make the conquest of their peninsula too costly, and would not formally join the 7 Kingdoms for another 150 years. After which, it joined by marriage treaty rather than military defeat, and so the 7 Kingdoms became, technically, one king. One throne, the Iron Throne, which Aegon had his smiths build from the swords of his defeated enemies, welded together by Balion's fire into a seat that is by all descriptions genuinely uncomfortable. This was deliberate. Aegon said a king should never sit easy. Whether he was being philosophical or just practical, the throne is made of swords. It was always going to have sharp edges, the image is resonant. The seat of power in Westeros is built from weapons. It is made of the thing that was used to fight him. Every time a king sits on it, he is sitting on the instruments of his predecessor's defeat. The Targaryen dynasty would rule for 300 years, and it would spend most of those 300 years demonstrating, in increasingly vivid ways, the central structural problem that every multi-generational dynasty faces. The qualities that produce a conqueror are not the qualities that produce a stable ruler, and they are almost never heritable. Aegon was a conqueror. His son Aenys was not. Aenys was pious, gentle, conflict-averse, a man who wanted to be loved and could not understand why the realm did not simply love him. His reign lasted 5 years and was characterized by constant rebellion. His half-brother Maegor, who seized the throne from Aenys' sons, was the opposite, brutal to the point of sadism, capable of violence on a scale that shocked even a population accustomed to Targaryen fire. Maegor the Cruel is what happens when a dynasty overcorrects from weakness to strength. He burned the Faith Militant, the military wing of the church, suppressed every rebellion with maximum force, and died on the Iron Throne, apparently by his own hand or by some agency unknown, with no clear successor. This pattern, the capable conqueror, followed by the weak inheritor, then the overcorrecting tyrant, then instability, is not unique to the Targaryens. It is the life cycle of every founding dynasty in history. The Carolingian Empire went from Charlemagne, who held it together through personal force and constant military activity, to Louis the Pious, who was pious but not particularly commanding, to civil war among Louis's sons that shattered the empire into 3 pieces that would eventually become France, Germany, and a Middle Kingdom that they spent centuries fighting over. The early Ming dynasty in China produced Zhu Yuanzhang, the Hongguo emperor, a peasant who founded the dynasty through military genius and ruled through systematic terror, followed by an immediate succession crisis. The Ottoman Empire's first 6 sultans represent arguably the most successful sequence of capable rulers in dynastic history. By the 17th century, it was producing sultans who rarely left the palace. The point is not that dynasties inevitably fail. The point is that they inevitably face a problem they cannot solve. How do you transmit the qualities that made you powerful to children who grow up in power? You can't. The founder earns the throne. The heirs are born to it. The born-to-it king is structurally different from the earned-it king in ways that no education, no training, no court culture fully compensates for. The Targaryens tried to solve this problem with dragons, the bond between rider and dragon being something that required courage or something like it. And for a while the dragons were numerous and the riders were many, it worked. But then came the Dance of Dragons. The Dance of Dragons. This is the event that the Second Targaryen Civil War, the one depicted in House of the Dragon, is named for, and it is the most important thing that happened to the Targaryens in their 300 years of rule, because it is the event from which they never recovered, not immediately, not visibly. But the Dance of Dragons was the wound that never healed, the structural damage that looked like it had been repaired but had only been patched, and the patch failed, slowly over the next 100 years, until there were no more dragons, and then, eventually, no more Targaryens. The dance began with a succession crisis that was, at its core, about the same question that has destabilized every monarchy in history. Who is the legitimate heir? King Viserys I, a gentle, well-meaning king, not particularly capable but not disastrous, the kind of ruler who maintains rather than builds, had a daughter from his first marriage, Rhaenyra. He had declared her his heir, something that was technically within his power, but historically unprecedented. Then his first wife died, he remarried, and his second wife produced sons, Aegon, Aemond, Daeron. When Viserys died in 129 AC, after 8 years of increasingly poor health and a kind of prolonged consensual king who is really in child ambiguity that breeds faction, the court split. The Greens, supporting Aegon II's claim as the male heir, moved first and placed Aegon on the throne within hours of Viserys' death. Rhaenyra, warned by Daemon, her husband, declared her own claim. Both sides had dragons, both sides had armies. And what followed over the next 6 years was a civil war so destructive that it killed more dragons than all previous military encounters combined. The historical parallel that most precisely mirrors the dance is the anarchy, the civil war between King Stephen and Empress Matilda in England between 1135 and 1533. The structural similarities are close enough that Martin has openly acknowledged the influence. Henry I of England had a legitimate daughter, Matilda, whom he designated as his heir after his son drowned in the White Ship disaster of 1120. He made his barons swear to support her succession. Then Henry died in 1135, and his nephew Stephen of Blois seized the throne before Matilda could secure it, arguing that a woman could not rule England. Matilda invaded. The war lasted 18 years. Neither side could decisively defeat the other. The country was devastated. The clergy, the nobility, and the common people all suffered through cycles of siege, raid, counter-raid, shifting allegiances, and the general catastrophe of having two claimants who each controlled parts of the country and neither could eliminate the other. It ended not with a military victory, but with a succession agreement. Stephen would keep the throne for his lifetime, but Matilda's son Henry would inherit it. The compromise that 18 years of war could not produce was finally achieved by time. Stephen died within a year of the agreement, and Henry II became one of England's more capable medieval kings. The Dance of Dragons ended similarly, not with clean victory, but with exhaustion and cost. Aegon II won, in the narrow sense of surviving and sitting on the throne, but he had lost almost everything in the winning. His sons were dead. His dragons were dead. But Aegon II himself died, poisoned, most historians believe, though by whom is disputed. The throne passed to Rhaenyra's son Aegon III, which meant that in the end, after 6 years of war, thousands of deaths, and the near extinction of their dragon stock, the Targaryens had arrived at roughly the compromise they could have made at the beginning. The Green faction had won the battle, the Black faction had won the succession, and the dragons. The dragons were almost gone. This is the thing that House of the Dragon is really about, beneath the politics and the family drama. Not who sits on the throne, but what the dance did to the dragons. At the start of the reign of Viserys I, the Targaryens had 17 dragons of varying ages and sizes, plus several unclaimed wild dragons on Dragonstone. By the end of the dance, 4 were dead in combat. 1, Fahar, the oldest and largest surviving dragon, was killed in a battle above the God's Eye, in a confrontation with Daemon and his dragon Caraxes that killed both of them. The 2 largest dragons of their generation dying together in the lake below God's Eye were the pact between the first men and the children of the forest had been made 8,000 years before. The symbolism is not subtle. Whatever the Targaryens had been, whatever protection they had provided against the forces the old gods knew about and the new gods ignored, it died in that lake. Aegon III, the Dragonbane, as he would be called, to his fury, watched his mother Rhaenyra killed by a dragon as a child. He hated dragons for the rest of his life. He was the first Targaryen king to have no dragon of his own. Under his reign, the remaining dragons died one by one. The causes are disputed. Disease, poisoning, the declining attention of a court that had lost its enthusiasm, until the last one, a stunted creature that historians call the Last Dragon. Died in 153 AC during the reign of Aegon III's son. It was the size of a small dog. The Targaryens spent the next 30 years trying to hatch new dragons from eggs, and failing, and trying again, and failing again. They never succeeded. Without dragons, the Targaryens were a ruling family with a famous name and a strong claim, but no military technological advantage over the great houses they governed. They were now dependent on political skill, on marriage alliances, on the loyalty of lords whose loyalty had never been tested by anything except the fear of fire. And they were not, in the generations that followed the dance, consistently producing kings capable of managing that dependency. Aegon IV, called Aegon the Unworthy, is the nadir. His reign, from 172 to 184 AC, is the one that Targaryen apologists wish they could erase. He was, by the accounts of his own contemporaries, a glutton, a lecher, and a mediocre political mind who elevated favourites and discarded them based on whim. He legitimised all of his bastard children. He had many, by many different women. On his deathbed, creating a permanent class of legal claimants to the throne who had every incentive to press their claims and no reason to be loyal to the dynasty they were threatening. On his deathbed, the Blackfire Rebellions, a series of 5 rebellions over the following century, led by the descendants of his legitimised bastard son Daemon Blackfire, consumed the energy and resources of the next 3 Targaryen kings. The last Blackfire Rebellion ended in 260 AC, less than 30 years before Robert's Rebellion. The Targaryens never had a period of uncontested, peaceful rule after Aegon IV. Never. Every generation had at least one major internal or external challenge to the dynasty's survival, which brings us to Aerys II, the Mad King, because Aerys did not emerge from nowhere. He is the product of this history. 300 years of a dynasty that started with unprecedented military power, spent that power on civil war, lost the source of it in the process, and spent the next 150 years managing decline while pretending otherwise. By the time Aerys came to the throne in 2062, the Targaryens were holding the 7 kingdoms together through political craft, the weight of tradition, and the genuine incapacity of the great houses to coordinate against them, not through any decisive military advantage. Aerys Targaryen was not born mad. This point must be made clearly and held firmly, because the easy narrative, the Mad King, the Crawl King, the king who burned people because he was broken from birth, obscures something more important. He was, by accounts from the early years of his reign, charming and enthusiastic. Tywin Lannister, who served as his hand, his chief minister, his operational government, for 20 years, did not serve a man he considered simply deranged. He served a man he considered capable, but increasingly difficult. The relationship between Aerys and Tywin is one of the most important in Westerosi history, and it is almost entirely backstory by the time we meet either of them, but it shaped everything. Tywin Lannister was, functionally, the most capable administrator the Seven Kingdoms have produced since Aegon the Conqueror's first hand, or his Baratheon. He was systematic, unsentimental, and relentlessly effective. Under his management, the realm prospered in ways it had not for decades. The Blackfire threat was finally extinguished. The treasury was stable, the great houses were managed, flattered, disciplined, and kept in line. Tywin was, in all practical terms, the king, and Aerys knew it. The realm knew it. The saying in court was that Tywin Lannister's shadow was longer than the king's south. And Aerys, who was insecure, who was proud, who had the particular fragility of a man who knows he is being outperformed by his own employee, began to resent it. What followed was a 20-year psychological deterioration. Not madness in the clinical sense, not the catatonic episodes of Henry VI of England, who would go weeks without speaking or recognising anyone around him. Not the episodic dissociation of Charles VI of France, who during his worst periods believed he was made of glass and would shatter if touched. Aerys' deterioration was more like Richard II of England, a king who was intelligent, who was functional, who had genuine political and aesthetic instincts, but whose paranoia became so consuming that it overrode everything else. Richard II spent his final years surrounding himself with a private bodyguard of Cheshire archers, forcing his courtiers to kneel before him and maintain their kneel for hours while he stared at them from his throne. And finally, confiscating the estates of the Lancastrian lords in a move so politically catastrophic that it united his enemies and triggered his own deposition. Aerys imprisoned Tywin's son Jaime in the King's Guard, an honour that removed Jaime from the succession and denied Tywin an heir, partly to punish Tywin, partly to keep Tywin's most valuable asset under the crown's control. He refused to meet with Tywin's daughter Cersei when Tywin proposed a marriage alliance that would have bound the Lannisters more tightly to the crown. He burned lords alive for real, and imagined slights, using his pyromancy's wildfire to execute people in ways that gratified his growing obsession with fire. He had always, by Jaime's account to Brienne in the bath at Harrenhal, loved the fire. The fire was clean. The fire did what he told it to. Unlike his lords, unlike his son, unlike his hand. By the time of the Great Tourney of Harrenhal in 281 AC, 3 years before the rebellion, Aerys was already far along this road. The tourney is the event that contains, in concentrated form, every element that would detonate into Robert's rebellion. Rhaegar Targaryen, Aerys' son and heir, crowned Lyanna Stark, betrothed to Robert Baratheon, with a wreath of winter roses, as the Queen of Love and Beauty at the tourney's end, passing over his own wife, Elia Martell. Whether this was infatuation, or the beginning of a plan, or something else, it was a public humiliation of multiple parties simultaneously. Brandon Stark, Lyanna's brother, later came to King's Landing to demand satisfaction, or Lyanna's release, or simply to shout Rhaegar's name in the street and call him out. The accounts differ. Aerys had Brandon and his father Rickard Stark arrested. Rickard demanded trial by combat. Aerys granted it. He named fire as his champion. Rickard Stark burned alive in his armour, while Brandon, bound and strung up, strangled himself trying to reach the sword that might have saved his father. Aerys then sent ravens to the Eyrie in the north, demanding that Jon Arryn hand over Ned Stark and Robert Baratheon for execution. Jon Arryn refused. The rebellion had begun. Robert's rebellion is the event horizon of Game of Thrones. Everything before it is backstory. Everything after it is consequence. The show spends 8 seasons dealing with the consequences of a war that ended 17 years before the first episode begins, and that war itself was the consequence of everything that came before. 300 years of Targaryen rule. One civil war that consumed their military advantage, 4 generations of political mismanagement, and one paranoid king who turned the realm's loyalty into its opposite. The rebellion lasted roughly a year. It is, from a military standpoint, cleaner than most. Robert Baratheon was a naturally gifted soldier, physically enormous, personally courageous, skilled enough with a warhammer that his battlefield reputation was, by all accounts, deserved. The decisive engagement was the Battle of the Trident, where Robert faced Rhaegar Targaryen directly and killed him. Single combat, river crossing, Robert's hammer finding Rhaegar's breastplate and driving the rubies from it into the water, which is why the river ford where it happened is called the Ruby Ford. Rhaegar died believing something. What he believed, whether he believed the prophecy, the Song of Ice and Fire, the idea that his son would be the prince who was promised, died with him. Jon Snow was born on a tower in Dorne 9 months later, and grew up in Winterfell knowing nothing about any of it. King's Landing fell when Tywin Lannister, who had stayed neutral through most of the rebellion, calculating, correctly, that the Targaryens were likely to lose and that the winning side would need him, finally declared. He arrived at the gates of the city with a Lannister army, and Aerys, believing him to be a loyalist, opened the gates. The Lannister army sacked the city. Aerys, at the last, ordered the pyromancers to detonate the caches of wildfire they had placed throughout the city, under the Red Keep, under the Sept of Baelor, under every major building in King's Landing, enough wildfire to burn the city to ash. He would rather burn it than give it up. He had always loved the fire. Jaime Lannister, 19 years old, standing in the throne room, watched Aerys give the order to the pyromancer Rossart. He killed Rossart, then he killed Aerys. He put his sword through the Mad King's back, and then sat on the Iron Throne and waited for someone to come and decide what to do with him. Ned Stark arrived first and found him there, and the image that stuck in Ned's mind, that coloured his judgment of Jaime forever, was a Kingsguard knight sitting on the throne he had sworn to protect. The king he had sworn to protect, dead at his feet. Ned called it the most dishonest thing he had ever seen. He was wrong. It was the most necessary thing he had ever seen. But Ned Stark was not capable of understanding that, because Ned Stark was a man for whom the oath was everything, and Jaime Lannister was a man who had learned, at 19, but the oath was sometimes the cage that made atrocity possible. This is the world that Game of Thrones begins in, a realm 17 years out from a violent revolution. A new king, Robert Baratheon, the man who won the war, who is, in peacetime, not the man who won it. Robert Baratheon was, to borrow the framework this channel uses for character analysis, a man who wanted glory and combat, who actually needed to be needed, who believed the world was most legible when it was organised around a fight, and who refused to see that ruling a kingdom is not a fight, but a sustained act of administration that he had no interest in performing. He drank, he hunted, he jousted, he left the actual government to his council. He fathered bastards across the kingdom with cheerful indifference. And the one thing that might have made his marriage to Cersei Lannister functional, genuine affection, was foreclosed before it started. because he married her already in love with a dead woman, Lyanna Stark, who had been the point of the whole rebellion and who had died before it ended. Cersei Lannister knew on her wedding night that her husband was not thinking about her. She knew whose name he whispered. She told Ned Stark so during their conversation in the Godswood in Season 1, without obvious pain, just fact, clear-eyed and cold. Cersei had, by that point, already reorganized herself around something other than the marriage. She had reorganized herself around the children and around the secret that made the children possible, and around the permanent low-grade war she was fighting against a court that treated her as a political asset rather than a person. Cersei Lannister's paranoia, and it is paranoia, clinical and real, is not irrational. She is a woman with genuine intelligence and genuine political instincts, who has been told, explicitly and repeatedly, that her role is to produce heirs and otherwise remain decorative. Oh, she is surrounded by people who would destroy her if they knew the truth about her children. So, her brother is her lover and her only genuine confidant, and he is also sworn to a vow of celibacy in the Kingsguard, which makes him simultaneously essential and perpetually at risk. Of course, she is paranoid. The question is not why Cersei Lannister is paranoid. The question is how she lasted as long as she did. The first episode of Game of Thrones begins with the death of Jon Arryn, Robert's Hand, whose investigation into the parentage of Cersei's children has gotten him killed by Lysa, his wife, acting on Littlefinger's suggestion, acting on her love for Littlefinger, which is its own catastrophe of manipulation. This death is the first visible consequence of the secret at the centre of the Baratheon court, and it triggers Robert's decision to travel north to Winterfell to ask Ned Stark to replace Jon Arryn as Hand. Ned's decision to accept is the next step in the chain, and Bran Stark's discovery of Jaime and Cersei in the abandoned tower, and Jaime's decision to put him out the window rather than let him go, is the step after that. Everything accelerates from here. The war that follows, what history would call the War of the Five Kings, is the first major outbreak of the structural instability that the realm has been managing since Robert's rebellion. 5 men claim the kingship simultaneously, or in close succession. Joffrey Baratheon, who has the throne, but whose legitimacy is fraudulent because he is not Robert's son. Renly Baratheon, Robert's younger brother, who has the military force and the personality, but no real claim. Stannis Baratheon, Robert's other brother, who has the legitimate claim and no one likes him. Robb Stark, King in the North, who has declared independence from a Baratheon throne he no longer recognises as legitimate. And Balon Greyjoy, King of the Iron Islands, who has declared independence because he always declares independence whenever the mainland looks weak. The War of the Five Kings is the Wars of the Roses, and the parallel is close enough that Martin has said so directly. The Wars of the Roses, the series of dynastic conflicts between the houses of Lancaster and York from 1455 to 1485, produced, at various points, multiple simultaneous claimants to the English throne, shifting alliances, betrayals, marriages of convenience, and the total destruction of the generation that began the fighting. The nobility that participated in the Wars of the Roses was, by 1485, mostly dead. The survivors were attainted, impoverished, or so thoroughly frightened by the experience that when Henry Tudor offered them an end to the fighting, they took it with relief that bordered on gratitude. Robb Stark is Richard, Duke of York, the claimant with the legitimate grievance, whose military skill is not matched by his political judgment. Or he is the young Edward IV, who wins battle after battle and cannot translate battlefield victory into political stability. The Red Wedding, the massacre of Robb Stark, his mother, his key bannerman, and his pregnant wife at the Twins, hosted by Walder Frey, arranged by Tywin Lannister, carried out by Rose Bolton, draws from two specific historical events. The Black Dinner of 1440, Edinburgh Castle, November 24th. The young King James II of Scotland was 10 years old. He invited William Douglas, the 6th Earl of Douglas, and his younger brother David to dine with him. The Douglas family was the most powerful noble house in Scotland, wealthier than the Crown, controlling territory across the south of the country, capable of raising an army that dwarfed the king's south. The invitation was extended in a spirit, apparently, of reconciliation. They ate, and then, and the accounts are consistent on this, a black bull's head was placed on the table. It was the death signal, prearranged. The Douglas brothers were dragged outside and executed on the castle grounds, their young king apparently weeping and protesting, apparently having genuinely believed the invitation was sincere, having genuinely not been told what was about to happen. The Black Bull's head is the fictional equivalent of the musicians beginning to play the Rains of Castamere. Both are the signal that the killing is about to start. The Glencoe Massacre of 1692 is the other source. On February 13th, a detachment of Campbell's soldiers, under government orders, arrived at the village of Glencoe in the Scottish Highlands, accepted the hospitality of the MacDonald clan, guest right, the same sacred law that Westeros recognises, and billeted in their homes for 12 days. Then, in the pre-dawn hours, they rose and killed their hosts. 38 MacDonalds were killed in their homes. Women and children who fled into the winter night died of exposure. The stated reason was that the clan chief had been late registering his submission to King William III. The real reason was political. The Campbells had old grievances with the MacDonalds, and the government wanted to make an example. The massacre was condemned, even at the time, specifically because it violated the principle of guest right. People who accept your hospitality are under your protection. The Glencoe Massacre is remembered not as a battle, but as a betrayal, and the specific nature of the betrayal, using the sanctity of hospitality as a weapon, is what makes it still resonate 3 centuries later. Martin combined both events and added a third element, the music. The Rains of Castamere, the song that plays as the killing starts, the song that is Tywin Lannister's calling card, the song about the last time a house defied the Lannisters and what happened to them, is the announcement that the phrase "know the Lannisters" are behind this. It is Tywin making his authorship audible. Tywin could have had the Starks killed quietly. He chose to have them killed publicly, to music, at a wedding, in a way that would be remembered. He wanted the North to know who had done this. He wanted it to function as deterrence. The Rains of Castamere is not just background music. It is a message. Your defiance has a cost. And this is the cost. And we are not hiding our involvement, because hiding it would waste the lesson. Tywin Lannister was wrong about one thing. He believed the lesson would hold. He believed that the destruction of the Stark military threat, Robb's army, Robb's bannermen, Robb's pregnant wife carrying his heir, would end Northern resistance. He did not understand the North. He did not understand that the North's memory is not political, it is genealogical. It is encoded in family stories, in the way children are taught to feel about the Starks and the Freys and the Boltons and the Lannisters. Stories told across generations in cold halls on long winter nights. The North Remembers is not a slogan. It is a statement about the nature of Northern identity. The Boltons, who flayed their enemies and displayed the skins, ruled the North for 2 years after the Red Wedding and never achieved a moment of genuine loyalty from a single Northern lord. Roose Bolton knew this. It is ultimately why Ramsay killed him, because Roose understood that what they had was occupation, not governance, and occupation ends. The political geography of the War of the Five Kings resolves into a new configuration that is not meaningfully more stable than what it replaced. Joffrey Baratheon dies at his own wedding feast, poisoned, it turns out, by Olenna Tyrell, who had no intention of letting her granddaughter Margaery be consumed by marriage to him. Joffrey's death produces Tommen, who is genuinely gentle, genuinely well-meaning, and completely unequipped to navigate the political environment he has been dropped into. He is pulled apart between his mother and his wife, and the faith and his own council, and eventually by events that no one his age and disposition could have managed. He walks out a window, not pushed, not literally. He walks out after his wife has been imprisoned, after his mother has destroyed the Sept of Baelor with everyone inside it, including his wife's family, after everything he thought he had was gone. He walks out a window because the world he was living in had already ended before he did. This is what Cersei's decision to use the wildfire beneath the Sept of Baelor to eliminate her enemies in a single stroke produced. She eliminated the Tyrells, the Faith Militant, and her own trial in one morning. She won completely, and the price was her last child. She sat the Iron Throne as queen in her own name, the first woman to do so in the history of the Seven Kingdoms, in a throne room empty of everyone she had wanted the throne for, alone. Exactly as Maggie the Frog's prophecy had told her she would be, all those years ago in the woods. Gold, their shrouds. 3 children, 3 deaths. Cersei's final 2 seasons are the story of a person who has won everything and lost everything, and is now playing a game for a throne that she has no one left to hold it for. She is, by the final season, managing something like managed delusion, pretending the Golden Company is a meaningful military asset, pretending Euron Greyjoy is a reliable ally, pretending the walls of King's Landing are protection enough against what is coming. She is not stupid. She knows what she is doing. She is doing it anyway, because the alternative, surrender, abdication, accepting that it is over, is not something Cersei Lannister's psychology is capable of. She will hold the throne until the city burns around her. And then the city burns around her. The dragons are back. Daenerys Stormborn of House Targaryen crossed the Narrow Sea in Season 7 with 3 dragons, a Dothraki horde, the unsullied army of Astapor, and a political coalition assembled over 5 seasons of campaigning in Essos. She was, at that point, the most powerful military actor in the world, more powerful than any Targaryen since Aegon the Conqueror, more powerful in some respects than Aegon, because Aegon had 3 dragons and no infantry. Daenerys had 3 dragons and 2 professional armies and multiple naval forces and a claim to the throne that was, by bloodline, unimpeachable, and she lost control of it. Not all at once, not through stupidity, through a combination of factors that anyone who has studied the history of revolutionary leaders would recognize instantly. The first is the isolation problem. By the time Daenerys reaches Westeros, she has spent years as an absolute authority in cities where her word was law and her dragons were the final argument. She has built her political skills in contexts where the nature of her power, liberator arriving from outside, backed by overwhelming force, aligned with what the population needed. She freed slaves in Astapor and Yunkai and Meereen. But freeing slaves is a specific political act with a specific political logic. It works when the population you are liberating is genuinely oppressed and genuinely wants liberation and genuinely has no existing loyalty to the power structure you are dismantling. The slave populations of Essos wanted what she offered. The populations of Westeros had a more complicated relationship with the existing power structure, and she arrived as a conqueror rather than a liberator. This is the difference between the American Revolution and the French Revolution, and it is the difference Martin is pointing to when Daenerys burns King's Landing. The American revolutionaries in 1776 had, by the standards of the time, a coherent political vision: representative government, property rights, the rights of Englishmen extended to the colonists, and the leadership class that had skin in the game of stable governance because they owned property and ran businesses and had families in the territory they were governing. When they won, they had to build institutions, and they had incentives to make those institutions work, and they had arguments about how to make them work that we still reference today. The French Revolution in 1789 had a vision: liberté, égalité, fraternité. But the social structure that the revolution destroyed did not leave behind a ready-made class of people capable of building what replaced it. It left a vacuum. And into the vacuum went the Jacobins, and the Terror, and then Napoleon, and then 25 years of European war. The energy of liberation, when it is not given a stable institutional channel, becomes destructive. Daenerys' turn. The decision to burn King's Landing, even after it is surrendered, even after the bells are ringing, is the French Revolution's terror. It is the moment when the liberator, denied what she had expected and surrounded by loss, chooses to use the tools of destruction that had always been available to her, and had, until now, been aimed in directions she could justify. Missandei is dead, Jorah is dead, Rhaegal is dead. The population of King's Landing has not risen to greet her as their queen. Jon Snow, the one person she trusts, the one person she loves, has pulled away from her, is being pulled by loyalty toward his own family and his own claim. She is alone in a way. She has not been since the very beginning. A girl on a ship going east, with a marriage to a warlord and a dragon egg and nothing else. And she chooses fire. Is it madness? Not in the clinical sense, not in the Ares sense. It is something more mundane and more disturbing. It is a person who has defined herself as a liberator, discovering that the people she came to liberate don't want her, and responding with the tools she has always had but promised herself she would only use in extremis. She crosses a line she said she would not cross. She does it consciously. And once you have burned a city that's surrendered, you cannot unburn it. You cannot unchoose it. You are now the kind of person who burned a city. Daenerys Targaryen is the end of the Targaryen dynasty, in the truest sense. Not because Jon Snow kills her, but because she demonstrates that the power of the Targaryens was always this: the capacity for mass destruction. When it was aimed at people's enemies, they called it liberation. When it was aimed at them, they called it madness. She is Aegon the Conqueror, and she is Ares the Mad King. and she is every Targaryen in between who used fire to settle an argument, and the difference was always only in the direction of the flame. Jon Snow kills her. He loves her. He kills her. He holds her in his arms, with a knife in her back, and Drogon, he comes not to attack him, but to melt the Iron Throne, which is the most artistically deliberate choice in the series, melts the throne. The Iron Throne was built by Aegon the Conqueror from the swords of his enemies, fused by Balerion's fire, and it is destroyed by fire, by the dragon of the last Targaryen. The throne that required a dragon to make is unmade by a dragon. The cycle closes, and Bran Stark becomes king. This ending has been criticised, contested, and defended across every medium that humans use to argue about things, and most of the arguments miss what Martin is actually doing with it. Bran Stark is not the most compelling character in the series. He is not the most sympathetic. He is not the most capable political operator in the conventional sense. He is the three-eyed raven, the repository of all memory, all history, 12,000 years of accumulated witness from the green site network of the Children of the Forest. He is the first Stark in 300 years, perhaps the first human in that time, to be the full inheritor of what the children built, and what the first men preserved in the north when the Andals burned it everywhere else. He is memory made king. This is the ending Martin appears to be writing toward, before the show moved faster than his books. Not that the most heroic person wins, not that the most deserving person wins, not that justice prevails, but that memory, the capacity to hold and transmit what actually happened, rather than what power wants you to believe happened, is the thing that must survive if anything is going to hold together at all. Sansa Stark becomes queen in the north, which is where the north always ended up, separate, independent, never fully subjugated. Jon Snow goes back beyond the wall, which is appropriate, because he was always more comfortable there than on any throne. Arya Stark sails west, which is where the maps run out. The world that exists at the end of the series is not dramatically different from the world that existed at the beginning. There is a king in King's Landing, the north is semi-autonomous, the great houses still exist, the faith is still present. The political structures Aegon the Conqueror built 300 years ago, altered by succession and war and civil conflict, are still recognisable. What has changed is subtler. The dragons are gone. The Iron Throne is gone. The line of Targaryen is, effectively, gone. Jon Snow's true parentage will likely never be acknowledged publicly, and he shows no interest in claiming it. The thing that made the Seven Kingdoms one kingdom is gone, and in its place is something that has no name yet, a council. A king without heirs, a queen in the north, and a lot of very tired people trying to figure out what comes next. What comes next is what always comes next. In history as in fiction, the tired people rebuild. They make decisions, some good, some disastrous, that their children will inherit. They create institutions that will outlive their understanding of why the institutions exist. They forget things that will be important again. They mistake the end of one cycle for the end of all cycles. They plant the seeds of the next catastrophe without knowing that is what they are doing. The wall is still there, partially destroyed, but there. The Night's Watch, or something like it, will be reconstituted. The Free Folk are now nominally south of what remains of the wall, mixed with the populations that had feared and resented them for generations. The White Walkers are gone, defeated by Arya Stark with a Valyrian steel blade through the Night King's heart. The weapon of old Valyria destroying what the children of the forest had made with obsidian and old magic. The long night lasted, this time, a single night. Because the knowledge had been recovered, because Sam Tarly had found the records, because Bran could see what needed to be seen, because the memory held. That is the only thing that ever works in Westeros and in the world that Westeros was built to reflect. Not heroism, not power, not the right bloodline or the right sword or the right dragon. The thing that works is memory. The knowledge of what actually happened, why the wall was built, what the Night King is, what Dragonglass does, what the children created and why. The knowledge that gets lost, generation by generation, institution by institution, when the threat recedes and the comfortable lie that the threat is gone becomes easier than the uncomfortable truth that it will return. Every empire in human history has had its war. The institution, the tradition, the social arrangement that existed to guard against the thing that had almost destroyed them. The Roman legions on the Rhine and the Danube, guarding against the Germanic tribes that had sacked Rome in 410. The Byzantine walls of Constantinople that held for 1,000 years until they didn't, in 1453, when the Ottomans brought artillery that the walls had not been designed to stop. The Maginot Line, built by France after the First World War to prevent the kind of German invasion that had devastated them, faithfully guarding against 1918 tactics while the Germans went around it in 1940. The knowledge that produced the war decays. The will that built the wall fades. The budget that maintained it gets redirected. And then something comes over the wall that the people on the other side had forgotten to be afraid of. Westeros has had its long night. It will, if Martin finishes his story, have another. The true ending of the Song of Ice and Fire is not Bran on the throne. It is the question that hangs over every civilization that has ever survived its first catastrophe. Now that you've survived, what are you going to do to make sure you remember what it cost you? The answer, historically, is not enough. Never quite enough. The boy sails north, beyond the broken wall, toward the end of the map, into the cold. He does not look back. He has been exiled from a world he helped save. Saved by killing the person he loved. Saved by being the kind of man who could not hold the throne even if he wanted it. Saved by the particular combination of honour and love and limitation that defines every Stark. He has spent his entire life being told who he is by other people. Bastard, brother of the Watch, king in the north, Aegon Targaryen, the prince that was promised. He is going somewhere that none of those names apply. Beyond the wall, in the true north, among the free folk, he is something that has no Westerosi name. The free folk do not have a word for king. They have a word for someone that other people choose to follow. The distinction is the whole story. 12,000 years of history, every civilization that rose on that continent rose by forgetting what the one before it had learned. Every collapse was, in some sense, a failure of memory, a failure to hold on to the knowledge of what had cost so much to acquire. The children of the forest forgot that weapons cannot be controlled. The first men forgot what the long night had cost. The Night's Watch forgot what it was guarding against. The Targaryens forgot that power requires more than fire. The Lords of Westeros forgot, during 3 centuries of Targaryen rule, what it had felt like to face an enemy that recognized none of their categories. And for a single generation, the generation of Jon Snow and Daenerys and Bran and Sansa and Arya, the generation that had to relearn everything the hard way, the memory held long enough. Whether it holds for the next generation is the question Martin is still writing toward. Based on the available evidence, 12,000 years of it, the answer is probably not forever. But the answer is also, sometimes it holds long enough. Sometimes the memory is transmitted. Sometimes a boy with wolf blood and the gift of sight becomes the repository of everything the world has learned and sits in a cold hall in a ruined city and remembers, so that others don't have to start from nothing. That is not a happy ending. It is not an unhappy ending. It is a historical ending, the only kind that the evidence supports. The throne was never the thing. The thing was always the knowledge of what it cost to build it, what it cost to hold it, and what it cost to lose it, and whether anyone in the next generation would bother to remember. There is a question that runs beneath every character in this story, beneath every decision and every betrayal and every moment of apparent irrationality, and the question is this: what does power do to a person who was already broken before they got it? Because that is the thing about Westeros that the show understands and the audience sometimes misses. Nobody arrives at power intact. Nobody picks up the crown or the sword or the position of advisor to the king from a place of psychological wholeness. They arrive damaged by loss, by humiliation, by the specific wounds that childhood inflicts in ways that never fully close, and then power amplifies whatever was already there. It does not create, it reveals, it accelerates. It removes the friction that ordinary life uses to slow a person's worst impulses down, and it replaces that friction with enablement. And what you get is not a new person. You get the old person, moving faster, with more consequences per decision. Start with Ned Stark, because Ned Stark is where the show starts, and because Ned Stark is the character the audience is meant to trust implicitly in the first season, and because Ned Stark is wrong about almost everything that matters. Ned Stark wants justice. That is the stated goal. He discovers that Joffrey is not Robert's son, that the succession is fraudulent, that the throne is being held by a lie, and he moves to correct the lie. This is what a man of honor does. This is, in the world Ned was raised to understand, the only acceptable response to what he has learned. What Ned actually wants, the psychological need beneath the stated goal, is simpler and more vulnerable than justice. Ned wants the world to work the way he was taught it works. He wants honor to be a functional currency. He wants the truth to be the thing that wins. He grew up in a world, the North, Winterfell, the culture his father built, where those things were broadly true, where a lord's word was his bond and the guest right was sacred, and a man who broke his oath paid for it. He came south for Robert's rebellion, and he found a more complicated world, and he went home as soon as he could, and he spent 17 years in the north, reinforcing his belief that the world he understood was the real world, and the south was the aberration. It is not. The south is the norm, the north is the exception, maintained by geography and isolation, and the particular culture the Starks had built. King's Landing is what power looks like when it is not insulated by cold and distance. And Ned walks into it without the tools to survive it. Not because he is stupid, he is not stupid, but because he refuses to see it clearly. He warns Cersei. He tells her what he knows and gives her a chance to flee. He does this because in the world Ned understands, you give your enemy a fair chance. In the world Cersei lives in, you give your enemy information they immediately use against you. The formative experience that explains Ned Stark is not any single event. It is the accumulated weight of being the second son. His older brother Brandon was the heir, charming, bold, the one who got the title and the expectations and the identity. Ned was the spare, sent to the Eyrie to be fostered with Jon Arryn, away from his family, learning to be useful in someone else's house. Then Brandon died. Then his father died. And Ned, who had been shaped to be the support structure rather than the centre, had to become the centre. He became the Warden of the North by accident, by grief, and he carried, for the rest of his life, the particular burden of a person who achieved a position they were not originally meant for and compensated by performing it with absolute seriousness. Ned Stark's honour is not just virtue, it is identity maintenance. It is the one consistent thing he can point to and say, "This is who I am, regardless of what I was supposed to be." Take away Ned's honour, and you do not have a less honourable Ned Stark. You have a person who does not know what he is. This is why he cannot bend. In the throne room, with Joffrey on the phone and Cersei beside him and a sword at his throat, Ned Stark could have said the words. He could have called Joffrey the true king, knowing it was a lie, saving his life. He knows it is possible. He can hear his daughter's names in the crowd. That is what breaks him. Not the sword, but Sansa's face. And for a moment, genuinely, he considers it. And then he says it. He confesses. He calls Joffrey king. And Joffrey kills him anyway, because Joffrey is 10 years old, with absolute power and a grudge. And because the one thing Ned could not plan for was a child who had not yet learned that you keep your word to political prisoners. Ned Stark's death is not a tragedy of honour. It is a tragedy of miscalculation. He miscalculated Cersei. He thought she would take the escape he offered her. He miscalculated the political environment. He thought truth was a weapon that worked in that court. He miscalculated Joffrey. He thought the boy would honour the deal his mother had made. 3 miscalculations, all stemming from the same source. A man who believed the world worked the way he had been taught, in the face of overwhelming evidence that it did not. What does his story reveal about the kind of person power attracts or creates? In Ned's case, it reveals what power destroys. Power, in the form of the handship, took a man who was effective and respected in his natural environment and placed him in an environment for which his psychology was specifically unsuited. He died, not because he was weak, but because his strengths, directness, loyalty, moral clarity, were the wrong tools for the job he had been given. This is not uncommon. The history of advisors and ministers who thrived in one context and were destroyed in another is long enough to fill its own library. Thomas More, who served Henry VIII with genuine distinction as a lawyer, a diplomat, and a humanist scholar, could not serve him as an endorser of the king's divorce from Catherine of Aragon, because More's conscience would not bend that far. and Henry's patience with consciences that did not bend was limited. More was executed in 1535. He had known it was coming. He went anyway, because, like Ned, his identity was non-negotiable. Stannis Baratheon is the character who most directly mirrors this pattern, and he is more interesting than Ned, because he has more self-awareness. Stannis knows what he is. He has no illusions about being loved. He does not expect the world to respond to his virtue with warmth. He expects it to respond to his right, and he will prosecute that right to the last resource he has, and when it is gone, he will prosecute it with the next to last resource. And when that is gone, he will find something else. Because Stannis Baratheon is the kind of person who does not stop. This is his greatest strength and his defining flaw, and they are the same quality. What Stannis wants is simple. What is his? He is Robert's heir by law, by blood, by every principle that the system of succession is built on. He earned his position. He held Storm's End for a year during Robert's rebellion, surviving on rats and leather, while Mace Tyrell's army sat outside and waited for him to starve, and he did not surrender. He broke Balon Greyjoy's rebellion. He served faithfully, competently, without reward or recognition, while Robert gave the handship to Jon Arryn and the most important military commands to others. Stannis has been doing the right thing for his entire life and receiving nothing for it, and his response to this experience is not bitterness, exactly, or not only bitterness. It is a kind of furious clarity. The law says the throne is mine. I will have it. That is all. What Stannis actually wants, the psychological need beneath, is acknowledgement. He wants someone to say, "You were right. You held. You did your duty when everyone else was looking for an exit, and you were right to hold, and you deserve what the law says you deserve." He never gets it. Robert never gave it to him. Davos loves him, but cannot give him what he needs, because what Stannis needs is not love, but vindication, and vindication from a loyal servant is not the same thing. Melisandre offers him something that looks like a divine mandate, the Lord of Light's chosen, the prince that was promised. It is a lie, or at least an error, but Stannis receives it with something that, for him, functions as relief. Finally, someone who sees it. What Stannis refuses to see is that his rigidity, the quality that allowed him to hold Storm's End, that allowed him to maintain his integrity in a court that ran on corruption, is also the quality that makes him incapable of governing. Governance requires flexibility. It requires the ability to make deals with people you dislike, to accept half measures, to recognize that the perfect outcome is often the enemy of the functional outcome. Stannis cannot do this. He burned his daughter, not because he is a monster. The scene on his face as Shireen screams is the face of a man doing something he has convinced himself is necessary, and finding that the necessity does not make it survivable. He burned his daughter because Melisandre told him it was necessary, and because his army was dying in the snow, and because Stannis Baratheon, faced with the choice between abandoning his campaign and doing something unforgivable, could not abandon the campaign. The campaign was the last thing he had. The throne was the point. The throne had always been the point. And he had burned everything else already. His brother Renly, in the shadow assassination that cost him the allegiance of the Stormlands and the Reach and most of his reputation. His wife. His dignity. Shireen was the last thing. He died in the snow outside Winterfell, already dead in every way that matters before Brienne's sword found him. Because the thing he had spent his entire life pursuing turned out to require him to become someone he could not survive being. The historical figure Stannis most closely mirrors is not a king, but an administrator. Oliver Cromwell, Lord Protector of England from 1653 to 1658, the man who won the English Civil War against Charles I, who had the king executed, who governed England with genuine administrative competence and total moral rigidity, faced, in his final years, a version of the same problem. He had won, he had the power, and he could not make it stick, because making it stick required him to make compromises with exactly the royalist and Anglican interests he had spent a decade fighting, and he could not do it. He dissolved Parliament twice when it proved recalcitrant. He imposed military governance through his major generals, basically martial law, when civilian governance proved uncontrollable. He died in 1658 of natural causes, but his regime died with him, because he had built it entirely on his own will and could not institutionalize it. Within 2 years, the monarchy was restored. Charles II entered London to crowds who cheered, and the man who had ordered his father's execution was exhumed from his grave and symbolically executed, his corpse hanged at Tyburn, his head put on a spike at Westminster Hall, where it stayed for 20 years. Stannis Baratheon lost, faster and more completely, but the structure of the failure is the same. A man whose virtues were indistinguishable from his vices, who could win battles and not build anything that outlasted him. Littlefinger is a different kind of failure, and a more instructive one. Because Littlefinger is the character in Game of Thrones who most precisely understands how power actually works in Westeros, and who uses that understanding to construct the most elaborate manipulation of events the show contains, and still loses. He loses because he makes the mistake that every Iago, every Thomas Cromwell, every Cardinal Mazarin eventually makes. He assumes that his intelligence is sufficient protection, that the ability to read everyone else's motivations means no one can read his. Petra Baelish's entire psychology is explicable from one event. He was 12 years old. He was in love with Caitlin Tolley, the daughter of the Lord of the Riverlands, a girl he had grown up alongside as a ward in her father's house. He challenged Brandon Stark, her betrothed, a man 6 years his senior, a man trained to fight from childhood, to a duel for her hand. Kat begged Brandon not to kill him. Brandon wounded him, badly, deliberately not killing him, because killing a 12-year-old boy in love with a girl was beneath a Stark. Petyr recovered. He never forgot the humiliation, not the wound, the mercy. He was kept alive by someone who did not consider him worth killing. He was the kind of person that Brandon Stark was willing to spare. Everything Littlefinger built for the next 30 years was a response to that morning. Not consciously, not simply. He is too sophisticated for simple revenge plots. That the infrastructure of his ambition, the brothels that gave him information, the positions that gave him access to the treasury and then to the realm's finances, the systematic cultivation of everyone who might be useful, the absolute refusal to respect any hierarchy he had not himself constructed, is the infrastructure of a man who decided, at 12, that the world as currently organized would always put him at the bottom, and that the only answer was to reorganize the world. He did not want Catelyn, not really, not by the time he was an adult. He wanted to be the kind of person that Brandon Stark would have considered worth killing. He wanted to be the kind of person that the system was built to serve, not to ignore. The historical figure Littlefinger most resembles is Roger Mortimer, the first Earl of March, the man who conducted an affair with Isabella of France, wife of Edward II, and who used that affair as the lever with which to depose the king, ruling London for 3 years as the effective regent, and ultimately overreach so catastrophically that the young Edward III had him arrested and executed at Nottingham Castle in 1330. Some figures had more wort. Now, Mortimer rose from the second tier of the English nobility, influential, but not among the greatest houses, through military competence, political intelligence, and a relationship with the Queen that gave him access to power he could not otherwise have claimed. He was ruthless in his management of rivals, had Edward II murdered in Berkeley Castle, and spent 3 years ruling England through a woman who loved him and a boy king too young to challenge him. Then, the boy grew up. Mortimer did not adjust in time. Edward III moved against him suddenly with a small group of loyal companions in the middle of the night, while Mortimer was in Nottingham Castle with the Queen. He was hanged at Tyburn 2 months later. Littlefinger's death at Arya's hands, on Sansa's command, in the Great Hall of Winterfell, follows the same structure. He had underestimated the Stark children. Specifically, he had underestimated that Bran Stark's ability to see through time meant that Littlefinger's entire career of manipulation was visible to him in ways no political intelligence could protect against. You cannot manipulate a man who can watch you doing it in real time and in retrospect. Littlefinger's greatest skill, the ability to appear to be something he was not, was neutralized completely by the one ability in Westeros that he could neither cultivate nor defeat. His fall is foreshadowed in his own philosophy. Chaos is a ladder. What he forgot was that if everyone can see the ladder, nobody falls off it by accident. Cersei Lannister, the most consistently intelligent political operator in the main cast of Game of Thrones, and the one whose intelligence is most comprehensively undermined by the things she refuses to examine. What Cersei wants is power. What she actually wants is safety, the specific safety of knowing that no one can hurt her children, and then, after her children are dead, the safety of knowing that no one can hurt her. What she believes about the world is that it is organized around the exchange of power. You either have it, or you are vulnerable to someone who does, and vulnerability is the condition she has spent her entire life trying to escape. What she refuses to see is that the people she loves most, her children, were never protected by her power. Joffrey's cruelty was protected by her power. Myrcella's gentleness was not. Tommen's sweetness was not. She spent everything she had protecting them, and they died anyway, by poison and arrow and despair. And the power she had accumulated was insufficient for the only purpose she cared about. The specific wound that formed Cersei is the Maggie the Frog prophecy. She was a girl, perhaps 10 or 11, when she visited the witch in the forest outside Casterly Rock and was told she would be queen, but another, more beautiful queen would come and cast her down. Her children would all die before her. She would be destroyed by the Valonqar, the little brother. She spent 30 years living inside that prophecy. Every beautiful woman who came near power was a threat. Margaery Tyrell, Daenerys, even Sansa. Every moment of her children's vulnerability was evidence that the prophecy was advancing. And the Valonqar, which she assumed was Tyrion, the little brother who she hated and who hated her, She spent her reign trying to manage and eventually to execute. The prophecy created the psychology that fulfilled it. Cersei's treatment of Tyrion, the systematic cruelty, the false accusation of Joffrey's murder, the death sentence, turned a brother who had, despite everything, tried to serve the family into an implacable enemy who would eventually help Daenerys burn King's Landing. Her obsession with removing threats created the threats. Her fear of Margaery turned the Tyrells from grudging allies into enemies. Her decision to use wildfire under the Sept destroyed the last institutional check on her behaviour, the faith, and produced the climate in which Tommen's death became inevitable. She did not create the prophecy, but she fed it, decision by decision, in the act of trying to prevent it. The Valonqar who killed her was not Tyrion. It was Jaime, her twin, her other half, the person she had been intertwined with since before birth. Jaime returned to King's Landing to die with her, not to kill her. That distinction matters. He came back because he could not let her die alone. They died together in the collapse of the Red Keep, under the rubble of everything Cersei had built, killed not by an enemy's sword, but by the consequence of every choice she had made, the city literally falling on top of them. The Valonqar interpretation that it would be a younger sibling, specifically positioned in opposition to her, was, in the end, a misreading. The little brother was the person who loved her. The death he brought was the mercy of not dying alone. Jaime Lannister is the character whose arc Game of Thrones handles most carefully, and then, in its final season, most controversially. He is, by any reasonable measure, the most psychologically complex figure in the show. He's also the one whose psychology is most legible through the lens of a specific trauma. The moment he killed Aerys Targaryen and sat on the Iron Throne and waited for the world to decide what he was. He was 19. He had joined the Kingsguard because Cersei was in it. There is a brutal irony in the most famous oathbreaker in Westeros having joined the Kingsguard for love. Because love is the thing that makes vows feel weightless, and because his father had arranged it to spite him. He had sworn his oath, and then Aerys had ordered the burning of King's Landing, and Jaime had killed him, and the man who arrived first to judge him was Ned Stark, and Ned Stark had looked at him on the throne and called him Kingslayer without asking a single question. Nobody ever asked him the question. Not for 17 years. Ned Stark didn't ask. Robert Baratheon didn't ask. The court didn't ask. The Kingsguard didn't ask. They called him Kingslayer, the man who violated the most sacred oath a knight can take, the oath to protect the king's life. And the fact that the king he killed had been about to murder 500,000 people was irrelevant. Because the oath does not have a clause for that. The oath does not say, protect the king unless he plans to burn the city. It says, protect the king. And Jaime killed him. What Jaime wants is to be seen, not forgiven. He has a complicated relationship with guilt, but seen. He wants someone to ask why. He wants the question to be considered seriously, not answered by assumption. He gets it, finally, in a bathtub in Harrenhal, from Brienne of Tarth, the one person in Westeros whose commitment to honour is absolute, and who therefore, paradoxically, is the one person whose understanding of what he did means something. He tells her the whole story, the caches of wildfire, Aerys' order, Rossart's death, the king's death. His choice to tell no one, because the explanation sounded like justification, and justification is what a man reaches for when he knows he has done wrong. And he did not want to sound like a man justifying himself when he knew he had done the right thing. He had stayed silent for 17 years because the truth sounded like a lie, and the lie was, in its way, more honourable. Heine's arc in seasons 3 through 7 is the story of a man who's been given a new identity, the man who lost his sword hand, who saved King's Landing from the inside, who is capable of more than the Kingslayer reputation allows for, and who cannot make the break from the old identity completely. He keeps returning to Cersei. He knows what she is. He loves her anyway, with the specific unreasonability of a love formed before either of them had a fully developed self. A love that is inseparable from identity because they grew up inseparable. He rides north to fight the dead because he made a promise. He leaves again because Cersei is dying and he cannot not go back. He dies in the rubble with her. Is this regression? The show frames it as regression. Much of the audience received it as regression, but the psychological reading is more ambivalent than that. Jaime does not return to Cersei because he has reverted to who he was. He returns because he has concluded, having seen what he has seen, that the world does not reward becoming better. He fought for the living at Winterfell. He was there for the long night. He survived it. And the person he did it for, not Cersei, but Brienne, is not someone he can have, not because of external obstacles, but because of what he is. He killed the Mad King. He broke every oath. He has done unforgivable things, justified by private reasoning that even he is not sure he can trust. Brienne deserves better than Jaime Lannister, and Jaime Lannister knows it. Not because he is unworthy of love, he is not unworthy of love, but because he is not the person Brienne needs him to be, and he cannot become that person by wanting to. So he goes back to the one place and the one person where the question of who he should be does not arise, because Cersei has never asked him to be anything other than what he is. This is not health. It is the final retreat into the only relationship that has never demanded his transformation. He dies as he lived, between the person he could have been and the person he was, in the rubble of a city beside his twin. The character who closes the psychological argument of the series is not Jon Snow, though Jon Snow's psychology is worth examining for what it reveals about the show's ultimate thesis. Jon Snow wants to do what is right. That is not a complex stated goal, but its simplicity is the point. He wants to do what is right, and he is willing to die for it. He has died for it, technically, once, and he will sacrifice anything, including his own happiness and the love of the person he has found, and the throne that is apparently his by birth, for the right action. What he actually wants is simpler and more human than moral purity. He wants a family. He has always wanted a family. He grew up as the bastard in someone else's family, loved, genuinely loved by Ned Stark, but never quite belonging, never quite having the name that made him fully part of it. The Night's Watch gave him a family of brothers. The Wildlings in their way gave him Ygritte, which is as close to a family of his own as he has ever had. And Daenerys, for a season, gave him something that looked like it could become one. He kills her. He holds her body in a ruined throne room, and he kills her because it is the right thing to do, and because it destroys everything she could have become, and everything they might have had together. And he does it because Jon Snow has never, in the history of the show, being able to do the wrong thing when the right thing was available to him, no matter the cost. This is his greatest virtue. It is also the reason he can never rule. A king who cannot do the wrong thing when the wrong thing is necessary is not a king. He is a saint, and saints are not useful in palaces. Jon Snow goes north. This is the only ending his psychology supports. Not the throne, not the court, not the political game that destroyed everyone who played it. The true north, where the rules are simpler and the obligations are clearer, and a man can be what he is without the weight of what other people need him to be. He is going to the place where none of his names apply. Beyond the wall, he is not Aegon Targaryen. He is not the king in the north. He is not even Jon Snow, not quite, because Jon Snow is the identity he built in the Watch, and the Watch is behind him now. He is, finally, simply a man walking north, in the company of people who follow him because they choose to, in the direction of whatever comes next. That is the only kind of freedom the show allows. Not the freedom of power. Power in Westeros is always a cage, always a target, always a weight that breaks the people who carry it. Not the freedom of victory, because every victory in this story costs exactly as much as the thing it wins. The freedom the show allows is the freedom of having done what was required and released the obligation. Sansa rules because she is suited to it, because she has learned from every cruelty inflicted on her exactly what those cruelties were designed to do, and she has refused to become what they were meant to make her. Arya sails into the unknown because she is the only character who is never looking for a home. She was looking for herself, and she found it, and now she is going to see what else there is. Bran remembers, and in the remembering is perhaps the only hope the history of Westeros has ever offered. Not that the cycle will stop, not that the next generation will learn from the last, but that someone, somewhere, will hold the memory long enough that when the darkness comes again, and it always comes again, there will be one person in the world who has not forgotten what it cost, the last time, to survive it. That is not optimism, but it is not despair either. It is something older than both. It is what the children of the forest were, sitting in their cave beneath the roots of the weirwood, watching 12,000 years of history flow through the network of the trees. It is what every librarian and every chronicler and every person who ever thought someone should write this down, it is what all of them are reaching for. Not victory, not safety, just the refusal to let the knowledge disappear. The story does not end because the story never ends. It pauses, as it has paused before, between catastrophes, in the space where the survivors try to build something before the next thing comes. And somewhere in the north, beyond a broken wall, a boy who is something between a man and a memory walks into the cold, and the trees watch. And somewhere in the root system of a weirwood on a frozen hillside, 12,000 years of watching continues. Patient and cold, and certain of one thing only, that the living will forget, and the forgotten will return. And the question, always the question, is whether anyone will have kept enough of the truth alive to face it. They have, so far, just barely, and just barely in this history is the best it ever gets.